Welcome back to another episode of Bass Fishing Declassified. In today's show, we're going to go over some of our favorite baits to use in November across the country, so make sure you stay tuned for this one.
All right guys, so it's fall right now, and one of my favorite fall fishing situations, since I love fishing grass, is whenever you have a big grassy lake like you see down in Florida pretty much everywhere, and then Tennessee River is also a great example. You've got these lakes that have a lot of hydrilla, a lot of milfoil, it's topped out on the surface, and it's really thick this time of year. And what is perfect in the fall is the fact that these grass mats have been growing really thick all through the summer. They get to their thickest point and they start choking off the light penetration to the root systems, and so during the fall the roots start to die off, but you still have that beautiful mat on the surface. So you've got places for the fish to hide underneath, and that you've got that cover on top. And one of the best ways to go in after those fish is with a punching rig. A punching rig like this is essentially a modified Texas rig. So instead of having just your traditional maybe a quarter ounce weight, you're using anywhere from an ounce to 2 1/4 ounces. So a really heavy tungsten weight, of course pegged to the line, so you want to keep this whole package together so it slides through that cover really well. I like to use just a rubber T-stop peg. That seems to work really good for me. You can also use bobber stops, whichever your preference is, but essentially you're using a big weight to punch through that grass. And one really key thing when it comes to choosing the right size weight is making sure that you use the smallest weight possible that still allows you to be efficient and get through that grass mat pretty much on every pitch, but also small enough to where you're going to have really good hooking percentage. As you get bigger with these weights, you tend to have a worse and worse hooking percentage. So going the smallest that you possibly can is really, really important. Now let's talk about the rest of the punching rig. So we already talked about the tungsten weight. You've got it pegged, but then I like to use a little bead like this right here. This is a flipping bead that is designed to make contact with tungsten. It doesn't chip, and that's really critical. Another thing that I think is really important for my fishing, and it kind of goes against the grain a little bit, is I like to use an EWG heavy duty hook. This right here is a Hayabusa 959. It's my favorite flipping hook, and the reason why I go against the grain and don't use the straight shank hooks with a snell knot is because I feel like the straight shank hooks and the snell knots hook the fish in places where there's too much bone and less, meat, like solid muscle. EWG tends to hook them in the cheek where it's really, really solid, it's really strong, and I tend to lose less fish with this hook. Again, it's kind of up to personal preference, and also the way that you set the hook. I have a lot of friends that are very, very, productive with a straight shank hook, so you can try either. I use a polymer knot, very, very simple. And as far as the baits go, there's two different styles of baits. You got a beaver style bait like this Z-Man palmetto bugs here, and then the other one that I suggest you trying is a cross style bait. A slender cross style bait like this right here. This is the Turbo Cross, and this has some nice flapping legs to it, creates a lot of action, but in general it's really slender and it goes through the cover really well. Some other key parts of this setup: braided line is a must punching. You want to use 65-pound braid. There's really no reason to go any lighter. And one of the things that's really important is choose a braid that's really, really smooth. You don't want that braid creating a lot of sawing sound while it's going through those mats. So I use something like the Seagar Smackdown, which is really smooth, and that seems to be a pretty important part of this whole setup. As far as the rod and reel goes, make sure that it's very, very stout and it is capable of pulling those big fish out of that cover. This right here is a 7/8 heavy flipping and pitching rod. This is the one that I like to use, and as long as it's very stout, it's long, over 7.5 foot or 7.5 foot or more, you're going to be good. And then finally, the reel that I like to use is a 7.2 2-to-1 gear ratio. You know, something in that kind of moderate speed gear ratio. You don't want to go too high up to the 8.1 to 1s or something like that, or too low. The 7.2 to 1 or something in that range, 7.6 to 1 seems to work really, really well. But that is the setup. Make sure that you cover a lot of water. The fish are always going to be ganged up in small little areas, and so you need to find those stretches of grass where the fish are located. So mat fishing and punching is one of my favorite ways to catch fall bass, and I know you're going to be very productive and catch some big fish.
So for me, in the month of November in the state of Texas, my top bait right now that I recommend you try or you throw more than any other bait is a swim bait. I'm not talking about those giant swim baits. Those will work too, but I'm talking about your swim baits that are 4.5 inches, your soft swim baits that are 4.5 inches or smaller, down to 3, even down to 2.8, but somewhere in between the 3.5 and 4.5, 5-inch swim baits. Those are the baits to throw right now in the month of November in the state of Texas. One of my favorite little swim baits to throw in the month of November and a lot of other times in the year is a new bait by the Yum Scottsboro team. So Scottsboro bait's been making for a while. Yum partnered with them, and they've got this awesome boot tail with a flat top, and they got a bunch of different colors with it, but this is a 3.5-inch bait. They offer it from 3 to 4.5 inches, but this is a fantastic bait to throw in the month of November. So on this particular bait, I've got it rigged on just an open hook, open shank hook. The hook's coming right out the top. I'm fishing this bait in open water, okay? I may fish it in some standing timber using forward-facing sonar, looking for suspended fish, but I'm targeting fish that are suspended either on structure, like timber, or on bait balls. And so if you have forward-facing sonar, you can actually see this going on in front of you, but also you can just graph with 2D, and you can find these areas that have timber and bait and fish in them, and then you can turn around and fish with confidence. But those fish are sitting higher than water column in November. This hook is like a secret hook for me. So I'm sharing this with you. This is like the biggest tip ever. I am throwing this hook, and this is what it looks like without the bait on it. So you can see, but the other key thing about this hook, it's small. It'll suit itself for a 2.8-inch swim bait, but it also will house like a 4.3 or 4.5-inch swim bait. It's meaty. This hook is not a light wire hook. This is a meaty hook. And so it's small, low profile. It's got big head sizes if you want a heavier head. But that's what this little hook here is made by Boss, and I'm not with them. But this is a little cool jig head that you need to go pick up and get you some different sizes. They got them in white, they got them in black. And so I literally just got off Lake Sam Rayburn and catching them left and right on little swim baits using my Lowrance Active Target and reeling it right over the top of their head. Those fish were sitting out suspended. The bait, sometimes they were pushing the bait to the surface, so those fish were only 3 or 4 foot deep, and sometimes I was in 30 and 40 foot of water. Again, just using your 2D, find where the bait's at. The fish will follow, especially in the month of November. They are chasing the bait and literally throwing this thing and almost a steady retrieve, keeping it above the fish. So if I thought the fish were 8 foot deep, I'm keeping that bait 6 foot deep, 5 foot deep, 4 foot deep. A lot of times I like to come up and get it. But so I'm throwing it out there, giving a good steady retrieve. I'm not twitching that bait. I'm not working that bait. I'm just a slow, steady retrieve. I'm just trying to look like another one of the pack swimming down there with all the bait. So I'm throwing that on a 7:3 to 1 gear ratio. This is a Kistler reel. Again, 15 or 17 pound fluorocarbon. 7'3" rod is my favorite length rod. I'll go to a 7.6, but 7'3", 7.6, I want to be able to cast a long way, and I want to be able to hook the fish well. So if I'm going to use that heavier shank hook, I like having like a medium heavy action rod so I can really plant the hook on that.
Hi everybody, and welcome back to another edition of Bass Fishing Declassified. Much appreciated you guys joining us today. We're going to be talking about fishing lipless crankbaits on the TVA lakes in the month of November today. And this is one of the greatest ways to catch bass in the fall time of the year. I think a lot of people sort of associate a lipless crankbait with like a pre-spawn springtime lure. But guys, it's one of the greatest ways to catch bass in the fall time of the year, especially in this part of the country. So a couple different things. I think a lot of people, they associate the TVA lakes like Lake Gunnersville and Chickamauga with aquatic vegetation. And yeah, this is a great area and the great places to catch bass on lipless crankbaits like this Mega Bass Vibration X. But also there's different type of structures that you can fish it on too, not just grass. So I'm going to cover the hard structure and the grass. First of all, let's talk about the grass a little bit. In order to catch bass on a lipless crankbait in the fall, you have to find the right grass density and level and location. what you're looking for is the shortest grass that you can find, or some type of a grass edge. If you have thick grass that's like matted on the surface, you can take a lipless crankbait, run it down the edge of the vegetation. But what I like to do more than anything is get out on the bigger grass flats and try to find that grass that's sort of 2 to 3 feet under the surface. And I take the lipless crankbait and run it over the top of that grass. Now, the height of the grass is dependent upon, you know, the setup that I've got. Most of the time in the fall time of the year, the grass is going to be a little thicker than during the pre-spawn. So a lot of times when I'm fishing a lipless crankbait over grass in the fall, I'm using heavier line, heavier equipment. So a lot of times if I don't want that bait to run as deep, I'll put it on like 20-pound test fluorocarbon line, hold my rod tip high, and just try to keep it just above that grass. It works really good in the fall time of the year if you have windy, cloudy conditions. You really need some wind for this to work good. But probably my favorite place to fish a lipless crankbait on the TVA lakes in the fall is on hard structure, because a lot of people don't fish this. A lipless crankbait is a really good bait to use when you're paralleling riprap banks. A lot of the TVA lakes have riprap on them. It's really good, like if you get in the back of the creeks where you can find isolated laydowns or stumps. One of the best ways to catch bass on a lipless crankbait that a lot of people don't do it is fish it around the same type of hard structure you would with a traditional crankbait. So I'll take the lipless crankbait and I'll just fish it around the edges of like a laydown timber, stumps, maybe around the corner of a boat dock, any type of hardwood structure where you can create that reaction strike for the bait coming by, because a lipless crankbait is one of the greatest reaction baits that you can have. Colors vary a little bit. I usually let my colors dictate by the weather conditions. If it's really low light conditions, like early in the morning, if it's rainy, cloudy, that type of stuff, sometimes I like a fire tiger color. If it's at bright sunny conditions where you have a lot of light intensity, I may go to a more shad pattern. And if you have a tremendous amount of wind, like a 20-mile-an-hour wind with some type of partly cloudy conditions, that's when I like the metallic finishes, like the bluegills or the chromes or something like that. So give them a try, guys. Fall time of the year in the TVA lakes. Great way to catch numbers and quality fish on lipless crankbait. Don't just relegate it to the pre-spawn, because it works really good in the fall too. So best of luck out there. See y'all later.
Really quick, if you guys enjoy the content in this video and want more personalized instruction, head to our website, fishthemoment.com. Then go to the virtual lessons page. Here you can book one-on-one virtual lessons with each member of the Fish the Moment team. In these 1-hour lessons, the Fish the Moment team member will break down your lake using Google Earth and a contour line map and answer any questions you have. Whether you're preparing for an upcoming fishing tournament or a fun weekend on the lake, make sure you sign up for one of these one-on-one virtual lessons so you're fully prepared to catch as many fish as possible on the water. Check them out at fishthemoment.com.
A blade bait is absolutely one of my top picks when you're talking about fishing in November. If you're way up north like where I'm at, you're going to go from open water to most likely froze over by the time November finishes up. And therefore, there's not a whole lot of baits out there that can generate a lot of strikes from fish that are very lethargic and moving into their wintering phase, where they basically go into a hibernation. But a blade bait is perfect for mimicking their primary forage during this time. And what I mean by that is, because you have falling water temperatures, that puts a lot of stress on the bait fish that are unhealthy. So that can result in fish dying, which are an easy meal for the bass. Most people think that when a bait fish dies, say it's a shad or an alewife or a perch, that it floats to the surface. And in fact, will actually sink to the bottom. And when it gets to the bottom, he'll probably flicker a few times, sink back to the bottom until he finally dies. At that point, he'll develop gases from decaying and float to the surface, which is when we generally see him and you find a big stinky fish on the beach. The reality is that bait fish that is slowly dying on the bottom of the lake is an ideal meal for a wintering bass. And that's what a blade bait does such a good job at mimicking. You're working a blade bait, you get it to vibrate up, it sinks to the bottom. Vibrate up, sinks to the bottom. It looks just like these dying bait fish. And that's one of the reasons why it's the best bait, in my opinion, for very cold water temperatures. Now, when you're looking for locations to use this bait, that varies a little bit, but generally speaking, I'm going to be looking for steep break lines. So either where you've got the steepest break lines itself, or where the brake lines start tapering off into a flat. That's a transition zone that can be a very good place to fish. And more than likely, you'll find me out on humps and way far out extensions on points, because in the northern part of the world, a lot of your smallmouth, a lot of your largemouth are going to be in their wintering phase, way out on the ends of points and way out on deep water humps. And that's just going to be where they're at. Ideally, if I can find some rock in those locations, that's going to help the bite, because a lot of times those wintering fish are going to hang out by rock because the rock provides warmth for them and comfort during the wintering phase. And therefore, I'm going to look for it. Now, one tip with a blade bait, because it's got exposed treble hooks, you generally will get hung up quite a bit if you're fishing around rock or you've got some sunken debris. But keep in mind, because it's a hunk of metal and lead, that it's got a lot of weight to it. So if you don't really set the hook and bury into that snag, most of the time you can get right over the top and just, you know, shake the rod tip and your bait will come free. It's a bait that I get hung up quite a bit using, but I very rarely lose one because of the shape and the build of it in itself. But if you're heading out in the water and you live anywhere where your body of water may potentially freeze over, you got to start thinking about using blade baits during the month of November. I've got a handful that I really like to use. One of the first ones and one of my old faithfuls right here is just a Silver Buddy blade bait. That's kind of like one of the oldest, been around for the longest period of time. Then we've got here the Knockin' Jaw, which is one that's made by Jackal. And then I've got one rigged up on my rod. This is the Berkeley Vibrato. All excellent baits, all baits that I will use anytime I'm out on the water during the month of November. When I pair this up with my equipment, we're talking about throwing it on 10 to maybe 12 pound 100% Berkeley fluorocarbon. And then the rod and reel that I'm going to choose is also pretty critical. I'm going to go with a 7.3 medium heavy fast action tip, and I've got it paired up here with an Abu Garcia Revo MGX reel. You want to have a rod that's got some stiffness to it and a fast tip, because you need to get your blade bait to vibrate as fast as possible when you raise it up. If you've got a rod that's got a softer tip, that means you got to raise your bait higher off the bottom to generate those strikes. And when you're talking about blade baits in the northern part of the world, these fish are in an extremely lethargic mode. They are tied right to the bottom. They're not going to want to chase. And therefore, the higher you lift your bait up off the bottom means the less likely you're going to get bit. You almost want to keep this on the bottom like it's a football head jig. You're just pulling it up until you feel it vibrate, and then you let it go back down. You're talking about 1.5 to 3 feet up in the air, maybe maximum.
My top lure for November is actually a lure that can be thrown year-round. It catches big fish, catches numbers of fish. For the Ozark Lakes, though, and Highland Reservoir type bodies of water, for the month of November, this lure, man, is my number one that I'm throwing. And there's a couple reasons for it that I will share here in a second. But y'all, that is a football jig. So during the month of November, and from my experience, you know, your water temperatures are anywhere from the mid 60s and even creeping down to the mid to high 50s, depending on where you're at in the country. the areas I like to target are going to be your secondary points and even your main lake point. I'm going to be looking for rock, y'all. And you know, there could be some brush piles nearby, but y'all, I'm going to be targeting rock specifically. Even your rock bluffs and some of these creeks. Y'all, like I said, this time of year, them fish, man, they're feeding on the bottom, and there's nothing better to throw than a football jig. Like I said, it's a bait that can be used year-round, but right now in November, it is football season, so that is time to throw the football jig.
Man, thanks to all our pros. Those were some really great tips in the month of November. Those are some top baits that I'm definitely going to try. I hope you guys are going to try them. Thanks for watching today's Bass Fishing Declassified video. Make some comments. Let us know what you think about the content. We hope you like it. Ask any questions you got, and we'll get back to you just as quick as we can. We'll see you guys on the next video of Bass Fishing Declassified.